Okay, we've got I think we've got now 30 participants and building quite fast, 35. And I've got us as now streaming live on Facebook. So I suggest we now we start. This is the online world, isn't it? There's nobody to say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, you have to just jump in. Okay, I'm starting now. Welcome everybody. Welcome to this Middle East Center hosted session, Environmental Justice in the Middle East, Activism, Resistance and Decolonization, which is part of the Decolonizing LSE events for this term. Decolonizing LSE is a collective of staff, students, the whole school community, thinking about decolonizing sort of a challenge across a whole range of activities, teaching, research, how we relate to each other on campus. And if you're interested, take a look, just search Decolonizing LSE. This event is also co-organized with Jadaliyya, which is an e-magazine published by the Arab Studies Institute. So again, we're very much happy to co-organize this event with Jadaliyya and the Arab Studies Institute. My name is Michael Mason. I'm the director of the Middle East Center here at LSE. Let me say, I know many of you are quite experienced participants of these events, so I'll run through the format, how we're going to go. I think it's going to be a great, I'm really looking forward to this session, by the way. And I haven't seen the presentations of the participants, so I'm looking forward to it as well. So what we're going to do is we have 3 excellent participants. I shall shortly introduce them to you. Each of them is going to speak for up to 15 minutes each, and we will hold questions until the end, until after they've spoken, of course. After they've spoken, we're going to have, I'll just say maybe 5 minutes of some discussion, some comments, perhaps picking out some common themes or questions. And then we'll go to questions from the, I was going to say questions from the floor, which is the real world equivalent. So I'm going to say questions from the virtual floor. Yes. And if you would like to ask a question, the format is we ask you please to type your question into the question and answers box, which you'll see at the bottom, the icon on the bottom right on the Zoom screen. And what will happen then, we'll see how many questions come through, and I will direct questions to the speaker, or whichever speaker, if it's an individual speaker or the speakers. And bear with me, I will try to make sure we get as many questions as possible asked during that period of time. Sometimes I might have to combine questions if we have lots of questions, but we'll do our best to be as open and inclusive as possible. This event, I should have said this straight away, is being recorded. So it's also being live streamed on Facebook around the world, and it will also be available after the event as an audio podcast through the LSE Middle East Center website. So thanks to all of you out there for joining us this evening in London and other times around the world, and we look forward to your participation. At the end of the webinar, there's going to be a short survey. You'll be asked to answer some questions about the webinar. This is just in terms of the Middle East Center getting feedback on these events and how we can do them in a way which is as effective as possible. If you want to tweet about the event, then you can use the hashtag Decolonizing LSE as one word, or hashtag LSE Middle East as one word. Okay. Now to the important part, which is welcoming the speakers. I will introduce the speakers in the order which they will talk to you. I'll start with Carly first because she is going to say some words, introductory words also before we go into the sort of formal presentations. So Carly Krakow is a PhD candidate. She's a colleague here at LSE, and a Judge Rosalind Higgins Scholar in the Department of Law at LSE. Her writing, research activism focuses on international law, environmental justice and human rights in the context of statelessness and displacement. She's a special projects managing editor and co-editor of the environment page at Jadaliyya. Jadaliyya is, by the way, a fantastic e-magazine. If you don't know it, go and search it. It's got a wonderful environment section, which I regularly consult. There's the advert, yeah. Her research is on the Palestinian West Bank, on South Africa and Greece. It's focused on various issues, including law, the politics of access to water, refugee rights, and justice for people affected by exposure to environmental toxins. You will see, as I introduce each of the speakers, why they are the perfect speakers for tonight, and how I think with the diversity of experience and knowledge, we're going to have a really good discussion. The next one so that's Carly. The Dr. Muna Dajani, I'm pleased to welcome, someone I know very well for many years, is a research officer at the LSE Middle East Center, working on a collaborative research project with Beirut University, titled Mapping Memories of Resistance, the Untold Story of the Occupation of the Golan Heights. For over 9 years, a decade, Muna has worked in the fields of environment development in Palestine, done many things involving grassroots initiatives, NGOs, universities, government bodies, looking at social environmental assessments, hydropolitics, advocacy, community participation. She's a policy member of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She's contributed to a series of research projects, including looking at the hydropolitical baseline of the Upper Jordan River, a project looking at transboundary climate security, climate vulnerability, and rural livelihoods in the Jordan River Basin. And she has a PhD awarded from the Department of Geography and Environment at LSE. And her PhD research looked at the distinctive livelihood practices by which farming acquires political subjectivity in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. She's particularly interested in that PhD. The PhD, by the way, another advert, is available on the LSE website, publicly accessible. So if you're interested, please go there. Particularly interested in the idea of samud, steadfastness, or staying on the land as a form of cultural resistance, a concept which might well pop up in the presentations and discussions. And then delighted to have from Beirut, Professor Mona Harb, who's a professor of urban studies and politics at the American University of Beirut. She's also research director of the Beirut Urban Lab at AUB. She's author and co-editor of a series of books, including, actually one's in French, I'll give you the English translation, Hezbollah and Beirut from the Suburbs to the City in 2010, and co-author of Leisurely Islam, Negotiating Geography and Morality in Shiite South Beirut, in Princeton University Press, published, and co-editor with colleagues on local government and public goods, assessing decentralization in the Arab world, which came out in 2015, and refugees as city makers in 2018. Her ongoing research investigates the public domain and urban vacancies, local governance and displacement, as well as urban activism and oppositional politics. So I think from that biographical introduction, you would agree with me, and I thank each of the speakers for making themselves available tonight in terms of this particular panel. I think we have a great diversity of interest, research interests on environmental justice in the Middle East. So with that, I'm going to move over to Carly now. It's going to say a little bit more about the topic before the speakers begin their presentations. Carly.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that very warm, welcoming introduction, and welcome everyone. We're so fortunate not only to have the director of the LSE Middle East Center chairing our event today, but to have Michael Mason with us as an expert in the geography and environment of the Middle East. So really looking forward to Michael's interventions as well in the discussion. This is an exciting collaboration. As Michael said, I think he covered most everything between the Middle East Center, Decolonizing LSE, and Jadaliyya and the Arab Studies Institute. And we would just like to note again that we're are especially delighted to be part of Decolonizing LSE's event series. This event is the final one, actually, in an exciting October lineup covering everything from political economy and the pandemic to empire and food studies, and today, of course, covering environmental justice. So we're thrilled to be part of this series, and Decolonizing LSE's work was really the catalyst for putting on this event. So stay tuned for more events and projects that will be coming up. Also, a special thank you to Nadine Almanasfi from the Middle East Center for coordinating everything in the lead up today. It's really deeply appreciated. And at Jadaliyya and ASI, thank you to Bassam Haddad and MK Smith and the entire team for all their support. As Michael shared, our discussion today will focus on environmental justice and its relationship with activism, resistance, and decolonization, examining how we define environmental justice and the often excessively narrow confines that limit the meaning and scope of environmental studies as a field. So we're really interested to further discuss questions in relation to Muna and Mona's work and my work about how resistance to colonial greenwashing is a fundamental part of a broader decolonizing struggle, about how the US and Eurocentric discourse on environmental justice is being pushed back against by indigenous perspectives, also about how disaster recovery can be reclaimed by the people actually impacted, and questions regarding how urban inclusivity can be more prominently appreciated as part of environmental justice discourse, and a whole lot more as well. So I'm honored to be here with Muna Dajani and Mona Harb, two outstanding scholars who I cannot wait to hear from and who will be focusing on some of the often less highlighted components of environmental justice in the Middle East. And I'll speak a bit later about environmental injustice and international law, focusing on Iraq and some other examples. But first, it's really a pleasure to turn things over to Muna as our first presenter.
Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. Thank you, Carly and Muna. And I'm really excited to be part of this event. I wanted to extend my thanks to all those mentioned, Decolonizing LSE for providing the platform, and the Middle East Center for hosting, Jadaliyya as well. And really excited to have this conversation today with all of the great scholars today. For the sake of time, and just hopefully I'll try to touch on a few topics that I find really interesting when speaking of environmental justice in the Middle East, and hoping that the question and answer will generate more specific kind of context or maybe examples of case studies or things we can go further into. But I wanted to take this opportunity to to talk about what environmental justice actually entails, what indigenous scholarship actually helps us illuminate that hasn't been, as Carly said, hasn't been done in the limited scholarship on environmental justice, especially in the Middle East. And I want to start by saying environmental imaginaries in the Middle East has been really confined by, colonial legacy. The fact that, the Middle East has been kind of always portrayed as this desolate place, a barren land that requires rejuvenation, that requires, the hand of the colonizers to come and harness natural resources, to invest and capitalize on these resources, and to turn the desert green. And that has been kind of a fixed imaginary of the Middle East for so long, and it still continues until today. And that very problematic colonial imaginary has dominated not only how others see the Middle East, but also how Middle East communities and societies have come to see themselves, and I'll explain that in a bit. So this idea of modernization has, really dominated the way we think about the environment in general. When we speak of environmental justice, there are two strands that I think it's really important to distinguish between. I won't go into details, but if we look at environmental justice from kind of the Western-centric perspective, environmental justice emerged as a way to address inequalities that have been shaped by social institutions and capitalist mode of production and colonial legacies of resource exploitation and dispossession by accumulation, and that has distributed harms to communities of color, to indigenous groups, to marginalized segments of societies. And the whole contention of environmental justice is how can we actually right that wrong? through institutions and through the rule of law, and on a wider scale through global environmental governance. But what this environmental justice, like this very Western-centric environmental justice definition keeps separating is separating nature from humans, and thinking always that humans will always have an upper hand on nature. And that, I think, is really an important distinction between environmental justice that also maybe acquires tools, maybe that are more technical and managerial tools to, eliminate, to reduce or eliminate the harm done by those systems of inequalities and oppression. Indigenous scholarship, on the other hand, I think that I find really, really inspiring and motivating and so rich, actually traces back environmental injustices to colonialism. And I think this is really important because when we speak of environmental justice in the kind of conventional scholarship and also in the activism and mobilization on the ground, we don't really see that. We don't really find addressing colonial legacy to be an important part of it. So Indigenous scholarships, including Kyle White and others, have talked a lot about it and said that actually environmental injustices stem back from the genocide that settler colonial and colonialism projects have instilled on Indigenous people, the extraction of their resources, their exclusion from those natural resources, and their attempt to eliminate the Indigenous population. And this has also kind of, I think, the biggest environmental injustice that he refers to, Kyle White, who is an Indigenous scholar, he speaks about the socio-ecological uprooting of Indigenous communities from their context. So he never separates, and Indigenous scholarship never separates nature from humans. And we're part and parcel of the same socio-ecological network and dynamics. So this abrupt, I think, especially if we want to understand environmental injustice in the Middle East, in settler colonial contexts like Palestine, for instance, and the occupied Syrian Heights that I work in, but I think also in authoritarian regimes that have been also practicing practicing environmental injustice through their policies and institutions. I think this is a very important distinction. So the fact that injustice has actually has been at the core of it has been kind of our detachment from our natural resources, detachments from our stewardship and connection, responsibilities, and roles to that natural, to that socio-ecological context. And I think another way to see it that it's part of a work that me and Michael worked on is kind of settler colonialism as a tool of misrecognition. So the fact that uprooting communities from their land basically enacts acts of misrecognition that ultimately transform societies completely. So we cannot think of environmental injustice only as harm inflicted on the environment, let's say on pollution, let's say of streams, or exploitation of water resources, or for instance, environmental injustice inflicted on humans themselves, whether in their for their own health or public health of the community. We cannot think of this separately. We have to kind of really look at the root causes of that injustice. And I do feel like, and I do think that Indigenous scholarship on the topic is really enriching, and Middle East studies has a lot to learn from that. I'll share with you just only 3 slides. Sorry, I don't have many. Just a second. So if we bring it back to Palestine, to the Jordan River Basin, a topic that I have been working on quite a bit, that has gained a lot of traction and interest from different water scholarships in water diplomacy and water conflict and cooperation scholarship. However, it has really focused on water as a resource, or water as a source of contention, of conflict and cooperation. It had never looked at water as the multiplicity of it and the injustice it inflicted upon us as speaking as a Palestinian, the injustices inflicted upon being actually detached from that socio-ecological context. So I look at these pictures, part of like the work that I try to do is to kind of really focus on social history of water. And I look at those images and I see relationships that have been lost. I see a socio-ecological network of responsibilities, of benefits and contributions to this environmental system that has been lost today. I see also relations and anecdotal richness that also, as for me as a Palestinian, that I don't really feel as Palestinians who have been there at that time in place. For me, the Jordan River Basin became a border, like Samer Al-Ataoud, who is a great scholar on water, speaks of as well. So the fact that water becomes a border, the Jordan River becomes a water, it becomes an exploited river, that automatically detaches Palestinian from it. And the fact that we cannot even reach it adds to that complexity. So this ontological and epistemological uprooting becomes really, really magnified. This brings us to environmental injustices of today, of that confined geographical space that have come to define what Palestine is. And we start framing environmental injustices in the fact that we cannot get access to water as Palestinians, the fact that Gaza is living under inhumane conditions when it comes to more than 97% of its water being unfit for human consumption, or the fact that water is being abstracted at higher rates for Israeli illegal settlers, where also Israeli illegal settlements and factories are dumping waste into Palestinian areas. And that causes the harm that we have talked about before. Again, I think this picture is not complete without talking about this environmental injustice that is basically that we have been detached, that we have been cut off from our this socio-ecological context that White refers to. And I feel like there is so much potential for us to start thinking differently about environmental injustice if we take on this way. And another thing that, again, is in the context of settler colonialism, we see a lot of attempts of greenwashing. So Israel is really famous for its attempt to carry out these acts of greenwashing. So basically, the idea is that Israel invests in or portrays itself as kind of the bastion of environmentalism, the fact that it has environmental laws to protect to protect people from picking what they called herbs from Palestinian mountains. Or Palestinians have always collected za'atar, akub, those indigenous plants that grow wild in the mountains. These are practices that have been carried over from generations, but today environmental protection authorities in Israel try to criminalize it since the 1970s, and through efforts of Palestinian activists and attorneys such as Rabi' Ighbarieh, the fact that this has been now contested in court. But the fact that Israel is afraid of Palestinians rerouting themselves in the land, acting upon this environmental justice that has been inflicted upon them when they were uprooted basically from that. And I think this form of environmental injustice is as important as the environmental injustices that we today focus on and emphasize in terms of distribution of harms and benefits. Same thing when we speak about, green colonialism, and I think here this the example of the occupied Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights, is another way to also look at it as an environmental injustice, because the right to resourcehood is denied for the Jawlanis, the Golan Heights residents who are Syrians, who identify as Syrians, and who have refused Israeli citizenship in the 1980s. And today they have been confronted for decades around the exploitation of their water resources, but today they face another green colonialism act where a big wind turbine company with the support of the Israeli government is trying to put the wind turbines or install them in the last remaining bits of their agricultural lands. And this contestation happens and continues to happen to reclaim rights to resources and to reclaim rights to belong, and again, to confront this environmental injustice. So I think these examples are really important. And another thing that also, when we try to decolonize the way we actually produce knowledge about environmental context in the Middle East, in Palestine specifically, we really need to be aware that this contestation, the settler colonial project is still doing that on a daily. So it's not an event, the famous saying, like, settler colonialism is not an event but a structure. It is true because today, I don't know if some of you heard, but in the middle of the olive harvest season, which is a very sacred season for Palestinians, it's the last, I would claim it's the last remaining socio-ecological existing context that they can actually reunite with their traditional knowledge and with their land. And what happens is that Israeli illegal settlers come and cut off trees. There has been a case, I don't know if you saw it online, of a farmer coming to find 200 of his olive trees being cut off. And this is kind of a testament of how settler colonial institutions and practices continue to carry out this elimination of the indigenous and cutting off their rootedness to the land. So that form of environmental justice should form the basis to which we actually make sense of environmental injustices and find mechanisms through which to address them that do not really rely only on technological solutions or on managerial solution even and institution, but kind of always contest with and really contest with those realities and that dispossession that lies underneath all of these injustices. And I would like to speak more about climate change activism and how can we also decolonize that, especially when it comes to the Middle East and Palestine specific. But I might leave it for the question and answer because I know time is short. But thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mina. Actually, that was perfect timing, 15 minutes. So yeah, but we can follow up some of those other issues perhaps in the questions in the discussion. So now we move over to Professor Mona Harb. I'm just waiting for Mona to come on. Mona, can you hear me?
I think she can hear us. I was writing her in the chat. She came on and then I think we lost again. There we go.
Oh, good. You're back.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
It's okay. Don't worry.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me share my screen. I'm unable to share, I think. Shall I try again?
Yes, please. Please try again.
I'm not getting anything. It's okay, I can do it without it. It's not very important. I have a few slides.
This proves to the audience out there that this is live.
Yeah, but do you want me to try to share my screen or should I
try
go
one
ahead?
more time? Let me just check the share. It says you can share from the control, but if not, then I suggest Are you able?
Yeah, I'm good. No, I'm not getting what I got earlier when I tried prior. So I'm going to just start. Okay, so it's not
and
a
if you did
problem.
want to email it to us, we can try and get it set up while you talk, but I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I'll try to juggle multiple tasks. Okay, so good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone, and thanks for the organizers. I'm really happy to be able to engage with such an important topic from my perspective as an urbanist and someone who works with urban planners. I feel a bit of an intruder, given I don't really work on environmental justice as such. So when Carly approached me and invited me to contribute, I wasn't really sure why, but then she explained that she thought that frameworks that I work with are complementary to the ones she uses. And I'm going to try to share with you today some of these frames. I think this is what Carly was referring to when she was insisting that I do have a lot to say on the topic. So I'm going to mainly structure my talk in 3 points. First, I'm going to discuss how critical urban studies and progressive urban planning adopt social and environmental justice as key values and share why a political practice of urban planning and advocacy planning are relevant frameworks to environmental justice studies, if there's such a thing. I will then share with you how I have been teaching with others at EUB and practicing and researching what I term political urban planning for the past couple of decades. And I will finally focus on the present disaster that we're living in Beirut in the aftermath of the August 4 port blast. And I will consider this a key moment through which we are experimenting with the practice of advocacy planning towards advancing a more inclusive city and a protected public environment. Oh, it works, I guess now. I'm going to try again and see if, yeah, I don't know, it's weird. Okay, anyway, sorry about that. Okay, so a few words on, critical urban studies and progressive planning as a practice. So these are branches of urban studies and planning that are largely inspired from feminist and neo-Marxist frameworks of thought. So they inform the work of urban researchers and planners who position themselves as what they call advocacy planners. So they openly advocate for rights, and they advocate for the rights of the most disadvantaged groups. And as the practice of advocacy planning transformed over time, they started also defending threatened, built, and natural environments. So mainly advocacy planners and people engaged in this political type of planning denounce what is referred to in urban studies and urban planning as the growth machine. Mainly how predatory and extractive forces of capitalism, the ones that Muna Dajani was mentioning earlier, seek accumulation and transform the social and communal value of land into a value of exchange that is commodified. And here I'm really paraphrasing a lot of people who talk about this in much better terms, from David Harvey and beyond. So advocacy planning is a practice that started with Paul Davidoff and Jane Jacobs in North America, and it has inspired generations of planners throughout the world. It also informed a lot of the literature, and Norm Krumholz, among others, have been pushing for planners to embrace a political role in their practice and to speak truth to power, to use their position to seek the redistribution of power and resources in just and fair ways, to redress inequalities or at least work towards this, to give voice and support to disadvantaged groups so they can organize against this growth machine, to protect the built and natural environment from predatory extraction, and to seek to advance inclusive cities and regions. So in other words, really to advance an agenda of social and environmental justice. So these urbanists have been pushing planners to engage in an overtly political urban planning, and to do that through their teaching if they're involved in academia, through their research if they do that, and through their practice if there are professional practitioners. And they even encourage them to consider engaging in direct politics through running for elections, for instance, national, municipal, syndicate elections, and through organizing and towards collective action. So as such, we have been seeing more and more planners engage in struggles and social movements all over the world. And their roles as activists and social movement organizers, I think, is very interesting to document. I believe they have skills and competencies that allow them to imagine, and I emphasize this word, to imagine and visualize other possible worlds. And this imagining, this visualizing, this envisioning of what some people would term as utopias, because these are words that don't exist, but that are possible alternate realities, I think they are key for the work of political action and towards imagining change. And here I'm referring to works of social movement theories that emphasize this importance of utopia and collective action and this imagination. Additionally, planners who are advocate planners who embrace politics and are openly against predatory capitalism play a very valuable role in understanding the power structures that configure urban and spatial planning policies or infrastructural policies that seek to extract resources from land, be it built or natural land, and accordingly they can contribute to helping struggles and activists and people engaged in social movements to identify ways to disrupt, contest, and potentially dismantle these power configurations. And we have seen some cases of successful struggles where planners have been engaged. It's difficult to relate the success to the roles of planners, but I suspect that they play a key role in advancing these struggles towards disruption and dismantling of such projects. So I'm thinking of anti-dam movements in India, in Brazil, even in Lebanon. I'm thinking also of anti-eviction housing movements in Europe and the US that have been quite successful in their quest. So that concludes my main first point, which is why and how the framework of critical urban studies and progressive planning practice is relevant to environmental justice and how it can further enrich its study. Now, moving to Lebanon as someone who's in urban studies and politics and who has been living and working here for most of my life, I have been using, adapting, and I would say experimenting with this framework as a teacher, as an activist, and as a researcher. And we live in a country which is a real laboratory, I would say, to study the predatory forms of capitalism. We are quite rich with a lot of resource extraction examples since the Civil War, but even before and much more in its aftermath. People who are familiar with Lebanese sectarian politics know that we have an oligarchy that have parasited very astutely public institutions, that it repurposed these public institutions for its own interests, that this oligarchy developed an elaborate growth machine in partnership with banks, firms, real estate developers that have financialized most of the built and natural environment of our cities and regions in our small country. So we have that background where, there's so much to do and so much to study and work with, but there's also so much to struggle against. And Lebanon and metropolitan Beirut specifically is quite rich with political and social groups that have been organizing for decades to try to challenge and disrupt this growth machine. So these organized groups include environmentalists, urban activists who have been increasingly better mobilized over the past 15 years. I would place the date around 2006 with the Israeli war on Lebanon. And they've been demanding and making requests for an inclusive and just city in so many ways, actually. And they're also demanding to protect urban and cultural heritage and public spaces that would be freely accessible to all. So a very strong, I would say, discourse of social justice and environmental justice, though these terms of environmental justice are not used in Arabic per se, but there is, I would say, narratives around this that we can link back to the values of environmental justice. So at AUB, with many colleagues and students and peers, we have been involved in several of these mobilizations, especially in the making of campaigns to fight the privatization of the coast and of public space, the gentrification of neighborhoods, the militarization of the city. We have been involved in demanding more inclusion of refugees, of people with disabilities, of migrants, of women in processes of city making. Particularly, we've been very involved in informing the process of reconstruction because, again, we live in Lebanon and we've had several wars. So after the Israeli war on Lebanon in 2006, we were quite engaged in that process of rebuilding, and we tried to advocate for a more inclusive process. We also were engaged in a campaign against the building of the highway of Fuad Boutros and Ashrafiyeh, in the campaign for the protection of the coast of Dajaliyyah al-Rawshi. And we also experimented with direct politics by participating in the municipal elections in Beirut in 2016 with Beirut Madinati. And we've been contributing to numerous protests and uprising, especially the latest uprising of October 2019, where we were engaged in multiple teach-ins in the squares, in addition to informing the drafting of political programs with a spatial dimension and an urban components. So this is a little bit the context, I would say, that informs the work we're doing now with the recovery. So the Beirut port blast of August 4 is really an extraordinary moment where we are again mobilized. It's most extraordinary, actually, and in so many ways, I don't really have time nor, I would say, even energy to dwell why and how, but I'm sure many people who are attending and contributing would know why these struggles are so difficult and so much more difficult the more we do them. Yet here we are engaged in another reconstruction process, another attempt to advocate for a good city, for an inclusive city, for a just city. So this time we're operating from a structure we managed to institutionalize in 2018, the Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut, which is a place through which we want to enable an ecosystem of change towards a just, inclusive, and viable city, I would even say cities throughout Lebanon. So we're doing that again through teaching, research, and critical engagement with practice, through meeting with as many stakeholders as we can, ranging from the very rare public actors we can still talk to and who still care for the public domain, to professional syndicates, namely the Order of Engineers and Architects and the Order of, the Bar Association, the lawyers. We're also trying to engage with international organizations and UN bodies, INGOs and NGOs, these groups that are at the forefront of the reconstruction, given the collapse, I would say, of public institutions within the context of the economic and financial collapse Lebanon is living currently, and the complete delegitimization of the state and its institutions and the corruption they're associated with. So at the Beirut Urban Lab, we're mainly working on 3 fronts. First is data collection and sharing. So we're building on a database we've been operating for the past 2 years, which includes layers of information about the city. And we're partnering with the multiplicity of actors to enrich it with more layers and to share it in open access with the public, because we really believe that the production of this georeferenced data set about the city is a foundation of work towards political change, given we don't have public data about the city or any city in Lebanon, actually. As advocacy planners, we're producing data and sharing it with all possible components of people engaged in collective action towards change. And we're producing data through a range of methods, qualitative and quantitative, with a big focus on fieldwork, observation, and surveys. And we also visualize and map this data. Ultimately, we want this data to produce, to contribute to the formation of an observatory of the reconstruction, through which we will be tracing and mapping the process of reconstruction across sectors, actors, and procedures. The second front we're working on is more localized, I would say, and more applied. So we're developing a methodology of work at the neighborhood scale that is a methodology of recovery. And we're doing this using citizen science methods and in the aim of co-producing knowledge with the community and trying to ensure a people-centered and inclusive recovery process, whereby the people targeted are the most disadvantaged groups. So refugees, migrant children, people with disabilities, female-led households, LGBTQ groups in the neighborhoods we're working in. And this is a long-term process, so we're just starting off with that one. And the third front we're working on is a visioning exercise, which actually is a series of exercises we're going to be launching in the next weeks, which is an attempt to envision the post-blast city, another Beirut that would be imagined with other urban and economic relationships linking neighborhoods and places and infrastructures, the ones that are much more inclusive, more ecological, more viable, and more equitable. So as you see, along these three fronts, our goals are quite clear. We want to advocate values and goals of justice, inclusion, and viability. We are doing this through multiple modalities and fora, through teaching courses and studios to students, through mentoring researchers and practitioners, organizing webinars and workshops, participating to a range of professional meetings, through consulting, writing op-eds, policy briefs, producing open access data sets, networking, advocating, organizing, and I'm sure I'm forgetting other venues as well where we're trying to infiltrate. So you see that we're engaged in these multiple fronts. In the slides, I wanted to show you some of our maps and some pictures of our work on the ground. You can see that on our website, BeirutUrbanLab.com. And I think I'm going to end with that. Sorry for lacking the images, and I'll try to share that if we have time later in the Q&A very quickly. There are 5 slides. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mona. And I think any of you out there interested in ways in which you mobilize to fight against environmental injustice or social injustice generally will find much there that perhaps we can go back to in the discussion. So thanks very much for that. So now on to Carly.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you so much, Mona and Muna, for those powerful presentations, really bringing the issues to life as always. And I'm eager to get to the interactive part of this event. And as Mona said, by design, we really push to bring together scholars of all different disciplinary backgrounds and push against those boundaries. So I'm so excited about the distinct viewpoints we've heard already and the relationships between the topics and themes discussed. As we make our way towards that discussion, I'll first share some thoughts and questions on today's topic, including from a perspective that critically analyzes international law's role in worsening or prolonging environmental injustice, as well as drawing on linkages between examples of environmental injustice in the Middle East and elsewhere, specifically first focusing on Iraq. And I want to start by noting a development that might initially seem a bit divergent from our focus, but that I promise will connect back shortly to all these pressing topics at hand. So last week, Honduras became the 50th country to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, enabling that treaty to be entered into force and to become legally binding for its state parties. Significantly, however, the global powers known to possess nuclear weapons are of course not parties to this treaty, notably including the US, UK, Russia, France, and China. Nonetheless, this entry into force is viewed as a major occasion within and beyond the realm of international law. But to revisit a long-standing debate, how are we to understand the impact of a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons that has been ratified only by states that do not have them, whether by circumstance, by choice, or by a combination of factors? A treaty that does not legally impact the majority of states, but the small minority of states in particular who have in practice largely uninhibited access to nuclear weapons. So in recognition of the treaty's 50th ratification, the International Committee of the Red Cross put out a series of compelling short videos on Twitter and other social media platforms. And they've shared these with a preamble that says, "There's no plan, no team of heroes coming to save you. We simply couldn't cope if the nuclear bomb is used again. That's why a nuclear ban is the only option." And the video goes on from there to show a gripping illustrated imagining of what the immediate aftermath of a nuclear strike would look like. Disaster, death, injury, cut off water and electricity, destroyed equipment from ambulances and hospitals that cannot even be used to aid survivors, maps that don't matter because borders and boundaries delineating neighborhoods and cities have been wiped away, and the ethical question of sending medical professionals and teams to assist survivors when radiation exposure is guaranteed for all who enter the affected areas. One of the videos shows the immediate effects, but then also jumps into the future. At 1 week, it says hospitals are overwhelmed and people are dying of acute radiation sickness. At 1 year, radiation has seeped into the water and the soil and the food supply is contaminated. In 10 years, many are dying from leukemia and various cancers that developed. And in 70 years, those who manage to survive worry about passing on the effects of radiation exposure to their children and future generations and their families. And when watching this, one obviously remembers the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the coverage of that, for which the 75th anniversary was just marked. But one could also immediately think of places in the world that have been unjustly bombarded, even if not necessarily through the use of nuclear weapons. The images of destruction will certainly resonate far too powerfully for those in Lebanon and Palestine, Yemen and Syria, and other locations that have each been uniquely impacted by the violence of wars and colonialism. But specifically to turn to the points in this video on nuclear weapons regarding inescapable long-term health impacts, radiation exposure, cancer, and birth defects, Iraq and the aftermath of US-led invasion and occupation is one place that immediately comes to mind. Of course, a single blast with a flash of blinding white light did not occur in Iraq. However, the rate of children born with birth defects in Fallujah, for example, has been understood for years now to be higher than the rate of birth defects in Hiroshima after the atomic bombing of 1945. And yet the slow, dangerous, and ongoing trajectory of toxic exposure in Iraq, which has been documented by scholars such as Omar Dawashi and Kali Rubai and others, has been obfuscated by a victor's narrative dominated by the US that has attempted to blur the clear linkages between the Iraq War and the devastation being experienced by Iraqis as countless children are born with disastrous and often fatal cancers, malformities, and malfunctioning vital organs. Only now, in 2020, over 17 years since the 2003 invasion, a bill has been introduced in US Congress that aims to provide access to care for US veterans exposed to toxins in overseas conflicts, including Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as more than 30 other countries to which US military personnel have been deployed. That's only since 1990. The bill names asthma, all cancer, emphysema, lymphoma, and many other conditions as service-connected. Even care for its own veterans has been fiercely resisted by the US government for nearly 2 decades. And again, that's if we only count from 2003, we could of course go back further. But a lingering and obvious question remains. What about justice and healthcare and assistance for Iraqis who were not deployed to Iraq for a set period of time, but who remain in their homes, drinking water and breathing air that has poisoned them? In the context of research I've been working on regarding toxic exposure in Iraq, I spoke with Dr. Mojgan Savabi Esfahani, one of the lead authors of a study from earlier this year that demonstrated that living near an active US military base in Iraq is associated with increased likelihood of congenital anomalies in infants and children. And one of the things that she emphasized in our conversation is the severity of impacts on Iraqis who have been forced to contend with exposure to depleted uranium and toxins from burn pits for decades now. She noted the severity of this type of sustained, consistent exposure for young children and for children born to mothers who have been surrounded by these toxins while pregnant, in comparison to exposure for military personnel who have devastating health impacts that are documented, but who were exposed comparatively so very briefly. The situation in Iraq is one that pushes us to reconsider how we truly understand a decolonial environmental justice framework, and the ways in which the concept and practice of environmental justice risks being subsumed under a narrative of environmentalism that is depoliticizing and privileges the impact of singular crises and events over the equally or more devastating damage done by protracted injustice that not only is about inequitable access to resources, but also about inescapable contamination. And in thinking about how to frame and do environmental justice work in line with the vision of decolonization, I would argue exposure to toxins is not even an adequate framework or language to continue to use. In Iraq or other places such as Gaza, where water contamination is a major challenge in the context of the blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip, toxic exposure does not capture what people are experiencing. Exposure suggests forced contact with contaminated substances. Yes, there's no way that can ever be good when you hear that. But in the cases we're talking about today, people are not merely exposed, but rather are drenched or saturated for years in inescapable conditions of confinement in which their health is constantly threatened and under siege. Just to step back a bit and look a little bit more historically, environmental justice as an academic area in the US in particular has revolutionary roots in connection with the civil rights movement and is driven by the work of Robert D. Bullard and others who spearheaded the documentation of clear links between racism, corporate pollution, governmental neglect, and public health and disease. As Bullard and others have noted, their powerful work came initially not out of theoretical research, but was sparked when Black communities were confronted head-on by toxic encounters simply because they had been deemed expendable by companies and by their governments due to racism. And in Iraq, we see an iteration of how the US military has deemed Iraqi lives expendable. In the time of the climate crisis, so much positive work has been done to show how already marginalized communities will be the most severely impacted by the effects of climate change. But at the same time as there has been increasing awareness in media and popular discourse, finally, about the climate crisis, there has also been a fixation on activism that is visible in cities like London, New York, Paris, and so on. And the dominating rhetoric is still largely rooted in threats of what is to come and the idea of protecting future conditions and future generations. Now, these points are vital and these protests essential, but they are deeply interconnected with other less visible realities of environmental injustice on so-called local scales that are actually interconnected and international in nature. And these conditions are already being experienced by civilians in Iraq and Palestine and Yemen and in many other places in the Middle East and beyond across the world. The subject of this event, I think, invites us to question how do we truly decolonize our understanding of environmental justice in ways that are substantial and true to a decolonial outlook in ways that don't dilute the power of decolonial terminology and approaches. Because discourse dominated by the idea that climate change will affect all of us is not alone sufficient when environmental injustice driven by the same forces and powers as the climate crisis is already affecting the lived daily realities of so many who are actively resisting in powerful, though often again, less visible ways, given the extreme and brutal pressures on their daily survival. And of course, when we're thinking about toxic saturation, birth defects, and disability, we're talking about communities that are often deliberately marginalized. Environmental justice in much environmental studies discourse is still often framed as a facet of the field, an important part increasingly, but merely a part nonetheless. How do we achieve an understanding of environmental studies that rightly sees environmental justice and health impacts as fundamental, and building on Muna's point about the obvious yet overlooked connection between humans and nature and the ways in which these categories are unjustly separated out? Something I'm looking forward to discussing more. How do we do this work so that the goal is not solely just to radicalize or rectify environmental studies as a discipline, but to put environmental justice at the top of agendas across numerous disciplines? And I think Mona showed a really interesting approach to that in the realm of urban studies. And on that note, I want to touch on international law and how the field of international law could engage with environmental injustice more meaningfully than it has historically. International law is so often presumed to be a source of rights, but it has been at the very least useless for Iraqis who are experiencing protracted injustice and violations in the form of health impacts, and also largely irrelevant in many cases of denial of water access, such as in Palestine, which is what much of my work is focused on. But I think these critiques and interventions about law apply to environmental and colonial injustices across the board. Beyond just uselessness and irrelevance, international law plays roles that have often proved to be more than irrelevant, but actually damaging, given how international law is historically embedded in structures of colonialism, imperialism, and marginalization. As Aimé Césaire wrote, no one colonizes innocently, and no one colonizes with impunity either, in his famous work, Discourse on Colonialism, in which he charts the barbarism that is intrinsic to all colonial projects. Can international laws that grew out of such projects evolve to be part of authentic, decolonized environmental justice? Well, as the legal scholar Anthony Angie has asked, what does it mean to claim that international law governs sovereign states when certain societies were denied sovereign status? And what continuing effects follow from this exclusion? I think we see many of those effects in the forms of the injustices being talked about today. A community need not be legally denied sovereign status at present in order to suffer from the types of harms and exclusions that Angie describes. Legacies of colonialism, slavery, and apartheid persist, even if communities formerly subject to illegality have since been granted legal status in some, though certainly not all, cases. What meaning can legal recognition and status possibly have for a population still saturated in unsurvivably toxic conditions? In my research, I'm interested in the concept of de facto statelessness and how conditions of war and toxic saturation create rightlessness and de facto statelessness, even if people are technically still in possession of citizenship rights, building on the work of Hannah Arendt, which argued that the only human right that actually matters is the right to have rights, which becomes meaningless unless enforced and protected by governments. Environmental injustice is so severe in places like Iraq, it unquestionably strips human rights and civil rights of their meanings. How does international law seek to remedy this, and how can it do more? Well, some examples: the International Criminal Court in 2016 issued a policy paper emphasizing prosecution of crimes that result in illegal exploitation of natural resources or the illegal dispossession of land. Additionally, just last month, the ICRC issued new guidelines on the protection of the natural environment during armed conflict, something I and other researchers and activists had advocated for a while now. But how can it be ensured that these sorts of developments do not only recognize the links between war, the environment, and health, but actually go beyond this in order to achieve reparations, including compensation, for example, for people affected by environmental injustice, and to lead to the implementation of policies that are not merely informed or marginally or superficially influenced by the people most affected by toxic saturation, but policies that are in fact steered by these communities. In our interview, Dr. Savabi Esfahani also emphasized the link between Iraq and another seemingly endless war that's often invoked in this context, the war in Vietnam. And it's worth noting that the US bill that seeks to provide care for veterans affected by toxic exposure since 1990 would amend Title 38 of the US Code, which outlines veterans benefits, and would specifically amend the same section that provided for Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange. So between Vietnam and Iraq, we see important parallels. Of course, the brutalities of colonialism dating back historically, but also denial of the impacts of toxins used on civilians relatively quite recently. And that denial persists very strongly. Vietnamese civilians were, of course, devastated by dioxin, the chemical component of Agent Orange, and numerous other herbicides used to clear the forests of Vietnam. The Vietnamese writer Bao Ninh has noted how with the arrival of Agent Orange in Vietnam, green leaves turned black and crumpled, grass withered and died. I witnessed many cruel scenes in the war, he writes, but the brutal massacre of nature is what comes back to me most often and disturbs my sleep. So again, emphasizing that important connection between people and the environment and the dangers of separating those out. Only recently, over 4 decades since the end of that war, has the US embarked on initiatives to clean up that so-called mess. Images of children born with birth defects in Vietnam are harrowing and similar to images coming out of Iraq. In poetry and literature by Vietnamese and Iraqi writers, as well as by Japanese writers after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's a shared emphasis on the long-term effects of forced toxic saturation during war. In Sinan Antoon's poem To an Iraqi Infant, for example, He asks a child whether they know that their tomorrow has no tomorrow, that their blood is being used as ink on new maps, that they are subsisting on their mother's milk, which is bursting with depleted uranium. And to begin to conclude, in her work regarding the pain of others, Susan Sontag, in the context of analyzing war photography and journalism, wrote, "It is intolerable to have one's own suffering twinned with anybody else's." And I just bring up that quote to note that by invoking these links between Vietnam and Iraq and Japan and Palestine and elsewhere, I'm not advocating for a comparative academic approach or an approach that in any way risks collapsing the key differences and unique aspects of these situations. What I am advocating for is an environmental justice framework that not only allows room for the people impacted by these injustices, as well as other activists and scholars to make these links, but for a radicalized framework of environmental studies across disciplines that sees justice as inherently woven into its focus, which should be inevitable, but in a pedagogical context, the standard teaching of environmentalism is often to have environmental justice as a week on a syllabus, or in an environmental studies anthology to have a single chapter among a dozen. And these exclusions manifest in a policymaking context as well that profoundly impacts people's lived daily realities, in which the damage to the environment in this policy framework is wrongly seen not as a key matter of justice, but as only one category among many in the bigger context of the ravages of war. So I think this discussion so far has been incredible for thinking through ways in which we flip that framework, and I look forward to discussing further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carly. You really threw the gauntlet down there for any legal scholars out there. So I'm hoping that will stimulate some questions. That was fantastic. Thank you. We do have already a couple of questions. Some of the questions have come through the chat box. So can I ask, if you want to ask a question, please use the question and answers box. As we've already got a couple of questions, I'll just say a few things first in terms of discussion and hopefully lead into the discussion, the general discussion. I really enjoyed all those three presentations very much. So I thank all of you for that. I think one of the things that you've all done is think about languages and disciplines and viewpoints, and each of the terms, environment, justice, injustice, is kind of problematized when we think about their application to the Middle East. And in fact, one of the questions is, should we even be using the term Middle East by Lamis Jamil? And because that is also arguably an Orientalist imaginary, and that has particular political effects. And we might come on to that. So I think each of you has invited us to think, about environmental justice in a way which focuses on, I would say, the kind of what we call the historicity of environmental injustice. In other words, understanding particular impacts in these lands, on these peoples in different ways. And that means, I think all of you have talked about understanding injustice as a process or a structure rather than simply a set of events, and not just simply an issue specific thing. So environment is more than an environment in a way. It's about the whole political economy and culture. And so all of you in different ways have talked about injustice is received both materially and symbolically. Okay, I mean, Muna used that very vivid kind of image of uprooting, physical uprooting, material uprooting, economic uprooting, social uprooting, cultural uprooting, ecological uprooting. It's a very visceral term to describe not just the uprooting of olive trees, of Palestinian olive trees and groves, but all sorts of other processes of dispossession and misrecognition. And but without trying to look for sort of some of the positives, Mona talked about ways in which you can mobilize against injustice, including, I think, given this is a webinar taking place, or at least being hosted by a university, the ways in which researchers, academics, scholars, citizen sort of activists can take part in assisting those that would want to challenge environmental and other injustices. And in terms of where we look for in terms of governance, Carly, I really enjoyed that very frank assessment of law and the deficits of law, including international humanitarian law, in terms of the effects of warfare, which unfortunately we're talking about a region which is often exposed to warfare, to conflict involving state actors, non-state actors, and the environmental and health effects of violence. So not just in terms of military violence, but other types of violence. And I think the notion of injustice tries to, as you said very, very ably, Carly, exposes us to all sorts of violent effects, which may not be the initial one that we see on the television of a military attack. There are all sorts of what are called examples of slow violence, things which accumulate over time, and of course, which some groups are more vulnerable to others. So as we've got questions coming in, I will ask you to hold those thoughts for the moment. I don't think there's any question there anyway, actually. It's just a series of statements trying to pull together the assessments. So at least in terms of the initial questions, I had that one from Lamis Jamil was decolonizing environmental injustice in the Middle East means, should we also think about the ways in which we imagine the region as an environmental entity or geographical entity? Is it, is Western Asia more appropriate? And I'll just add another question, which I think is directed, it was directed to Muna from Lena Ismail, who said, what does it mean in the Middle East to decolonize climate change? But if the others of you have things to say on that, perhaps, you're welcome to join. So we'll leave it with those two questions first, and then I'll collect some others up. Thank you. Who wants to kick off?
I can jump in, though. I don't know
Sure,
if you want to take that question. Maybe we'll go around. We'll keep it lively.
Yeah.
But thank you, Michael, for synthesizing everything so eloquently, and again, really amazed by what everyone here shared. Just briefly, I guess, to kick off the responses, absolutely. I'm really interested to talk about language and how, I think, as Michael pointed out, sort of each of these pieces of the terminology we're using are problematic in their own way. So when we think about the environment, thinking again about what Muna raised about the separation between humans and nature and how that's deeply problematic, and I think comes up really interestingly in Mona's work about urban environments and also thinking about built environments as well. And I think, a discussion about working towards alternative language is perfect in this context of decolonial frameworks. I think a lot of it has to do with relying on what the precedent is and relying on what is recognized. And as we know, that's a slippery slope, and there's dangers in that, and language might seem minor in the scheme of things, but law, for example, is language. It's all about how these things are worded in the minutia and the breakdown of who is included and excluded. So definitely, I think advocating for a progressiveness to the language and a reform and revolutionizing of that is an integral part of this discussion. I'd like to hear what my colleagues say about that. The only other thing I wanted to add initially was with the question about decolonizing climate activism. I know some of the most incredible, inspiring work that I've seen has been when local groups are able to connect with each other. So when we have activism against the pipeline in the US and indigenous communities working on that, for example, linking up with Black and Brown communities in the US disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and with communities in Palestine facing the very injustices that Muna so articulately explained. I think when these groups band together and bring their so-called local, and I keep saying so-called because as we know, it really isn't merely local, but these local experiences of injustice, when these links are made and then that unified force is brought to work towards climate justice, I think that is where a lot of the really promising just and decolonial work is taking place. But I'll pause there. And
before we jump there to that issue of climate justice, because it actually corresponds with the question which Carly Hamid has just asked, which is how can these local initiatives work towards environmental injustice issues which cross borders, as in climate change? So I think I would say to Muna and also to Mona, because she was talking about this sort of local mobilization. How do you think about how you scale that mobilization to address the issue? Muna, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks to all, and thanks, Carly, now for your kind of good introduction into the topic of decolonizing climate change mobilization. And yeah, on that point, I also really I agree with you, and kind of thinking about the context specific conditions through which we understand such an issue that has been framed globally, that has dissipated, the political and context-specific, conditions of how different people are actually dealing and combating with climate change differently. And I think that's really important, because depoliticizing issues on climate change actually is a big problem, and especially when actually framing Palestine as a climate or framing Palestine as a case of climate justice actually starts doing these linkages with other communities around the world and other marginalized groups that are facing the brunt of climate change at all levels. So I think it's really important to speak of the politics of climate change and to put it at the forefront that context matters, that local experiences matter, but at the same time to open it up for intersectional solidarity and common mobilization and kind of stronger linkages. And I do agree that a lot of cases where that started to happen, where like this kind of communication and channeling of mobilization ideas and strategies has started happening with Standing Rock, for instance, where Palestinian presence was really seen there, and where like that linkages started kind of popping up for even Palestinian Americans who maybe have been part of, that living in that settler colonial space for very long, but never really understanding their positionality there. And I think another thing is that the risk of the current kind of, let's say, the normalized climate change mobilization is that it seeks to depoliticize, it seeks to like unify, but I do find it very problematic to do so. And this is what kind of a call for decolonizing climate change mobilization and action would be through, this framework of justice, where context would matter, colonial legacies will come to the forefront, not as a historical event, but kind of as ongoing process of dispossession, and kind of really again, go back to the collective and to that socio-ecological dynamics and relations where we are part of and where we have responsibilities in, rather than individualistic actions or actions and policies that kind of this also framing of environmental governance today actually prefers. So I think that's what I have to say for now, but we'll see if there's something else comes up.
Thank you very much. Mona, do you have anything to add? Perhaps on this question about sort of with mobilization, the choice of scale when you think about, because you mentioned about the 26 municipal elections, so there are choices made by activists as to which is the appropriate scale to mobilize on.
Well, yeah, actually, I wanted to reflect more on the existing transnational networks that already exist. Maybe they don't have a territorial dimension, but they exist through a lot of exchanges between activists that happen in multiple ways, in exchanges where activists know each other, read about each other, consult each other. There's a lot of learning happening, and what the literature refers to as policy mobility is happening, I would say, among the environmental activists I've worked with and urban activists. So there are connections that are national and that transcend already, and I think these are very important to document present than we think, and I don't think the literature documents them enough. The number of people who know each other in these circles is quite astounding. Upscaling and intersections are very important for effectiveness of social mobilizations. We've seen that in many cases. I'll speak about Lebanon, where the last uprising of October 2019 was multi-centered and transcended the capital city. And this is also what gave it a lot of impetus, where intersections between multiple profiles of activists was very strong too. So I'm completely aligned on what Muna and Carly said about the importance of this in collective action. But at the same time, we have so much violence and repressive regimes that even when this happens, it doesn't lead to change or to a reversal of action. And I think Lebanon is an excellent case study where, you know, we did everything by the textbook and we coalesced and we intersected, we did everything, and still, you know, the power of the repressive regime was so strong that we were not able to, this was not translated in any effective political change. So we're also working against apparatus and systemic systems of, ingrained systems of inequalities and repressive regimes that are extremely powerful and able to reproduce themselves in such impressive ways that I don't know what else could be done in terms of mobilization. So I thought it was important to raise that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, because some of the environmental justice scholarship presumes a sense of agency, which works in perhaps where the original historical American context, although it doesn't always work there, actually, to tell the truth, but that is somehow transferable, and particularly when you're dealing with state structures which are very powerful and hegemonic and nakedly repressive, then it means the strategies available are really, really challenging. I had a couple of questions here about Iraq, but maybe they might generate some wider sort of relevance. So to Carly initially, Noura Al-Shibli, the question around, actually this was from the chat box, about the detrimental health and environmental effects in Iraq. The questions about, there's a whole legacy of effects there. It's not just the US strikes, there's the Iran-Iraq war, there's the Ba'athist regime's chemical warfare, drainage of the Mesopotamian marshes, you know, so there's a whole assemblage of environmental injustice there. So how do we kind of approach that in that kind of holistic way, we might say? And the second was somebody, Mohammed Bilal, who enjoyed your talk about or presentation about this environmental toxic sort of landscape, but asked, are there any enforcement mechanisms there with international humanitarian, I presume international humanitarian law, although you talked about some in terms of civil law in the States as well. So perhaps if I direct those to you initially. Yes, thank you.
Michael. Thank you. Yeah, excellent questions. And thank you. I think it was Noura, you said, who asked the question about Iraq. That's absolutely right. Obviously, you know, there's limitations on time to be able to go into sufficient depth with the long history there, but it's really important to emphasize the complexity and the layers and the nuance of that situation and the other examples invoked, and you know, Saddam Hussein's weaponization of water and the violence by non-state groups. You know, as Michael mentioned, there's a lot of different factors going on. I think what we're trying to do here is complementary with that approach. And I think in the writing and further research of the scholars here, you really see that come through with Iraq specifically, but with all the other cases. And I saw some other comments in the chat referencing other examples saying, you know, what about this place that is forgotten, or this place that's out of the limelight right now? And I think that's absolutely right. And I think, you know, I wish, and maybe we will have a series of panels where we can systematically and more fully go through each of the examples, because I think, unfortunately, part of building a decolonized environmental justice framework that escapes some of the traps that Michael pointed to specifically is about building a framework and an outlook that actually expects environmental injustice. Now, not normalizes it, not says that, oh, okay, this is something that we're just going to have to accept and work around, but that actively expects that this is the norm for more people than not, and this is what people are contending with. And I think that plays in nicely with Muna's points about the uprooting that is going on and the uprootedness, because I think that's something we see with the damage being inflicted, but then that idea of uprooting is also something that we see come back around with the resilience and resistance and activism at play. So just connecting some of those ideas, and happy to talk more about Iraq if I can, but in the interest of time, I'll first just go to the next question. Thanks, Mohammed. So yeah, about international law, keeping it relatively brief, but I don't dismiss international law fully, though some scholars do. And I think, you know, there are legitimacy to those arguments, but I think, and many others have argued, if there is a chance for activists and communities to force international law or anything else, at least partly, to work for just people-driven goals, then we should take advantage of every framework we have and try and mold that framework to achieve those goals. Now, it's not sufficient alone. I'm not saying that's entirely possible, but I'm saying that if there are ways, for example, specifically with reparations and compensation, to push the international system to achieve at least that limited kind of justice, then that is something worth pursuing. One example, this is more pointing out something problematic than necessarily something purely positive again, but you know, there's been critiques about the trust fund for victims being housed within the International Criminal Court because of the flaws with that structure, and pushes towards international justice being able to provide reparations in other decentralized ways. There is material within international humanitarian law, within the Geneva Conventions, prohibitions against, you know, violence to civilian populations and water and agricultural equipment that would be damaging to the civilian population. And there is a pretty expansive body of international water law, which I've written about quite a bit, but it's the disconnect and the lack of conversation, if you will, between these different areas that I think in the legal realm creates a lot of the problems. But even more importantly, I think activism is answering a lot of these gaps in meaningful ways, whereas the law itself at the international scale is moving quite slowly. But I'll pause there.
I will just before allowing Muna or Mona to come in, it's perhaps because there was another question here which is more general. Actually, it's from Kali Hamid again. Obviously, enjoyed our session so much with another question, yeah. And this is about the extent to which so-called mundane practices with environmental damage, whether oil, gas, exploitation, construction, the Gulf states mentioned. There's an environmental justice challenge from to kind of, and I'm interpreting this partly, this question, by the notion of the idea of sustainability. And we know all about the idea of sustainability, international discourse, and sustainability is the means by which many power wielders or brokers sell environmental responsibility. So I think the question here, we can think perhaps about other examples across the region, is that is sustainability something which is useful to the term or thinking about environmental justice, or is it something which might impede environmental justice, or does it depend on the context? I will open that up. Muna or Mona, I don't know if you've got any.
I can't have my camera on right now, but yes, I just want to kind of follow up on a few of the comments that Carly made about international law and international humanitarian law, and kind of, yes, the fact that they are needed as tools to, you know, rectify and to hold to account, you know, for instance, environmental violations and human rights violations. However, I think, as we know, in the case of Palestine, like a lot of that has kind of gone to deaf ears, and people, and I think it, at certain extent, relying heavily on that as a framing, you know, as a framing of environmental issues can be a bit problematic, because it really undermines, depoliticizes communities as well in their quest for seeking environmental justice in other for us. So I do think that mobilization has really took a step back in Palestine, if we really specify the case, because of that kind of depoliticization and the fact that this is kind of the role of others to carry out, whether professionals, state actors, and governmental institutions. So the role of the citizen becomes less and less, and this is where I think empowering that kind of collective spirit, I think, is really key, especially when we first produce knowledge about environmental issues and environmental injustices, but also when we mobilize against the perpetrators of that, whether it's state agencies or whether it is corporations, multinational corporations, or others. That's one point that I wanted to make, but I think the second point I want to say is about, well, I don't know much about this exploitation of oil and gas, but I know that this is also an issue that, like it's kind of hidden. And I think one thing is that really allows it to be hidden is kind of this kind of concretization of that type of, industry and that type of infrastructure like that really plays a role as well in it. I had another point that I forgot, but maybe I'll come back to it later on if I have a chance. Oh yes, actually, no, I remember it now. About kind of the kind of collective solidarity and mobilizations with other issues, and kind of like the need to go beyond the geographical boundaries. And I do believe that is the case, that we need to do much more in the Middle East, especially because I think being confined with our own regions and our own environmental injustices, we need to go beyond that, and not just mobilize and create solidarity channels with others around the world, but also within. I think I've learned a lot personally from visiting sites in Turkey of the Il Sudam, and understanding the problematics and the vast expanse of such destruction acts of submerging whole communities and cultures because of state centric hydraulic mission, or whether visiting understanding more about the Nile and arrangements that are now coming to the forefront between Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan because of the Renaissance Dam. So there's so much that we can learn from, and I think this is where we need a more kind of a concise and collective effort in academia to bring to the forefront these issues, and not just, as Carly said, like just study them in 1 week when we address environmental justice, but kind of to be a part and parcel curriculum on political and critical political ecology and, decolonial methods and methodologies of understanding and studying the Middle East or Western Asia, or also that needs another reframing, but yeah.
Thanks, Mona. I would, on that, I mean, and allow Mona to if she wants to answer, because you started there to address, because I think we've got time for one more question, and a question actually put in the question and answers box by someone you cited in your presentation, Professor Samir Alatout, who talked about, or asked about, where is the source of solidarity going to come from? In the 20th century, there was a sort of understanding of class solidarity, an internationalist understanding of class solidarity, which now has disappeared. I'm paraphrasing. So where do we go to organize that solidarity, to articulate local, global intersections, as you say? So I think you're already talking about that in terms of that kind of networking, but I'm going to open up. And we'll have this as the last sort of opportunities for comment. I know we could ask other questions. We can go on all night if we wanted to, but we have to stop in terms of the our allotted time. So who would like to go? Mona.
Would you like me to say something? Yeah, sure.
Yes, please.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks to all the questions. Actually, they're very engaging. It's a very compelling question. It reminds me of the third worldism, right? Efforts that existed at some point to try to form another force of against first and the third world. And I started following some of these efforts that were emerging. I think in Europe, there are attempts to intersect powers by anti-capitalist forces that are interesting to follow through. I don't know much about them. I also don't know in this moment where of rise of fascism and right-wing forces everywhere. I feel like there are so much struggles to do at the local and national scale that these connections beyond, you know, your daily lives of survival are becoming harder and harder. It would be great, I think, to expand solidarities and to think about the global solidarity fronts. I don't know how possible these are. I think the environmental movement is something to possibly look at, although I'm sure many of you here would critique it, as I've been hearing from what you're saying as well. So I don't think I'm the best person placed to answer that question, but I want to echo the discussion that Muna was having earlier about what's also, I would say, the corollary of when we talk about environment, we focus maybe on the natural environment specifically, but I think as someone who works on the urban, the built environment is also key. And, this is where the cycles of capital accumulation happen enormously. And I think the question about the Gulf states and thinking about the oil and gas sector or the industry is very much about one of these cycles of accumulation that gets translated and materialized in the built environment of cities, and then financializing further this built environment. So for me, instead of thinking through sustainability, I think what we need to do, we need to bring in this vocabulary of accumulation by dispossession, financialization, the transformation of the social value of land into an exchange value, the commodification of land, the loss of land as a common good that needs to be protected. This is what we need to bring in the conversation. Buzzwords, I would say that it's not even a concept. Buzzwords like sustainability or governance don't do much. They really serve further to depoliticize the issue, as has been very well explained by my colleagues. So I think one of the things we can do as scholars and people who work on these issues is to inform the debate with these words, to make sure that people understand that there's a process through which land becomes a commodity. There's a process through which land becomes owned by private developers and the commodity that is exchanged, and it becomes that we're completely dispossessing its collective value as it used to be. It used to be shared and it used to be celebrated as a collective good. And I think for me, this raises the key issue of who protects that value of land that is collective today, when the state is at the service of these predatory interests, when the multiple institutions of the state become institutions that enable this market economy, that this predatory capitalism. It becomes the responsibility of these civil society groups, environmental activists, other activists, which doesn't add up. I mean, how much can these groups do? They can claim, they can defend, they can inform a debate, they can organize and mobilize, but I think the Lebanese example shows it very strongly. If you don't have public ingredients who care to protect this common good and the public interest, it's very, very hard to reach anywhere. There's a glass ceiling that we can't go further beyond. So I'll stop with that.
I can jump in. I don't know if Muna had anything else to add first, but I guess quickly to run through these questions, I agree with what Mona has said with sustainable development and the dangers of that. I mean, I suppose there's somewhat of a pragmatic angle within that on a case-by-case basis, if there are initiatives that come up that are housed under sustainable development problematically, that perhaps that's an opportunity to make an intervention and say, there's some of the work here that's really good, but why is it being framed in this way and what can be shifted or built upon? But yeah, I think, you know, as everyone here has touched on and knows from their own work, in general, and never want to fully generalize, but sustainable development and the idea of kind of how can we keep doing everything we're doing without causing too much harm and kind of just get away with continuing to accrue profit is antithetical to all the important work being discussed here. And I think that connects, you know, to the points about industry and corporations and how that's a really fundamental part, of course, that we want to connect that. And also when we're looking at, you know, corporate militaries and all these things connect, whether we're talking about war or pollution from the oil and gas industry, just to hit that point again, that it really does connect in ways that I think in and of themselves could go on for hours talking about. But to get to Dr. Alatoot's question just briefly, I think we can and should have another event on this topic alone, but I'll make a few brief points just to say, going back to this idea about not focusing solely on singular events, but looking at structures and patterns. And I mean, last week we had another LSE event on states of emergency and crisis conditions. We also talked about Iraq, and Sinan Antoum was one of the speakers for that. And I think that's something key just to emphasize for thinking through these frameworks, again, not succumbing to that trap of only focusing on singular events. And I think the key is the work and activism being done to shift environmental justice away from being, again, a mere piece of the pie, and instead creating a reciprocal framework in which health, the natural environment, and as Mona said, the built environment and issues of corruption and national governmental roles are all really a core part of that. I think the pandemic has forced some, certainly not all, organizations and institutions at these international levels to, if not confront, to at least be confronted with a lot of these connections, discrepancies, and disproportionate impacts. But it's really important, I think, to build on that and ensure that it doesn't just slide into another iteration of depoliticization. And I think the last thing I'll just touch on is international law, again, going back to some of the really important points that Muna added. When looking at the Palestinian case, I mean, I think you definitely see a scenario where international law has been deployed to facilitate and prolong statelessness. And there's a quote from the legal scholar Jacqueline Baba, who writes, "Legal identity does not guarantee a good life, but the absence of it is an serious impediment to one," something along those lines. And I think in this case, Muna's work shows it, and the work of, you know, others, I think, in this event and outside of it, that evidence shows that prolonging statelessness is a tactic to aid in the occupying power's acquisition of land in Palestine. So in that sense, we really see what I mentioned with the dangers of the way international law is deployed. But I hope we can get a copy of these questions from the chat and the Q&A box, because I think each of them is really rich for further discussion, but I'll let Muna weigh in as we're pressing up against time. I think, Michael, you're just muted. I don't think we can hear you.
You're muted, Michael.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, any last comments?
I don't want to reiterate like these great important points, and I do believe that we've got so much still to kind of go through. Especially the questions have been really stimulating, and I feel like we need to do another one of those events. But I just wanted to maybe just go back to kind of the point of reimagining, you know, like a Middle East or a region where these relationships that we spoke about in the beginning also need to be kind of reimagined and start working towards it. And I do believe that, you know, a lot of the frameworks that we have talked about and problematized do offer something to help with that. But I think it also requires kind of an overall of values, meanings, and understandings to help us get there. And I see in the chat a lot of people like talking about sustainability and reducing carbon footprint. And I think this type of, narratives are really great, but we need to, again, put it in context, problematize it first of all, and try to kind of also decolonize it through, seeing how does it really benefit communities on the ground, and how does it really benefit a justice work that's being carried out, whether in settler colonial context or other authoritarian regime context that we're living under. And I think, one thing is about just, changing patterns of consumption, definitely, but also it's about, like putting justice at the core of it for all residents and communities in the Middle East. So that's my thing.
Thank you very much for that, Muna. I'm afraid we have to stop there. And it's always a good thing where you feel frustrated that you have to stop something because you can carry on discussing all night, it seems. But thanks so much, everybody. First of all, to the panelists, to Muna, and Carly. Thanks very much for your presentations and your responses to the questions and discussion. And thanks very much to the audience. For the participants, for those fantastic questions, which have generated such productive discussion. And we hope there'll be other comments, other events like this. Yes, and we hope we can continue this conversation. So thanks, everybody.